What does it take to balance mental health and professional success in the high-pressure world of architecture? Discover how Doug Hodgson is redefining workplace well-being and sustainability in this episode of Architecture Business Club, the weekly podcast for solo and small firm architecture practice owners just like you who want to build a profitable, future-proof architecture business that fits around their life. I'm John Clayton, your host. If you're a small practice leader or sole practitioner in architecture struggling to find clarity or reach your goals, consider working with me. I offer personalised one-to-one support through coaching, consulting and mentoring. This tailored approach helps you navigate your unique path to success. Whether it's growing your practice, working fewer hours or building your team, I've got you covered. Just click the link in the show notes to book a call with me to discuss your options, or email John, that's Jon, at architecturebusinessclub.com for more information. Now let's discuss mental health and well-being. Doug Hodgson is an architect and leads the retrofit agenda for New Works, a practice he co-founded to explore a new way of working based on the principles of specialism and collaboration, well-being and sustainability, with a fundamental belief that well-being in the workplace generates better relationships and better architecture. Prior to New Works, Doug had co-founded TDO, was a design fellow at Cambridge University, and in 2020 was named in the Architects Journal 40 Under 40. Doug is passionate about improving mental health and well-being, and has found from his own experience of being proudly openly gay that there's an urgent need for greater kindness, understanding and inclusion in the construction industry to make the profession more relevant. Doug, welcome to Architecture Business Club.
Hi, John. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. It's good to have you here. Doug, I know that when you are not busy working at New Works, that you enjoy spending a lot of time outdoors, and you have an allotment as well, don't you? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, we've been lucky enough to have the allotment for a number of years, and we had to sort of completely clear the brambles and get stuck in. But the moment in time that it really felt like an absolute blessing was during COVID, where we were able to actually go from our home to this rather extraordinary place and spend time and have that connection to the outside and to other things other than the sort of the day-to-day rhythms of architecture that we all try to maintain during those COVID lockdowns. We had this ability to get outside. So I found that moment in time incredibly sort of revealing about mental health and how I saw others struggling on these Zoom calls as we were all doing at that time, that didn't have that sort of connection and that ability to go somewhere else during that period.
That's a great way to reconnect with nature. My parents, a number of years ago, they used to have an allotment as well. And I visited them a few times while they were there at the allotment. And one of the things I noticed was that a lot of the folks that had the allotments, they also had like a little shed or a little hut there as well, where they'd have like a little area to make, a cup of tea and some chairs to sit down in a deck chair and admire all the hard work that they've been doing on there. And it was a really tranquil, relaxing place. And I was kind of quite envious of that, actually. I was like, this is amazing. Obviously, there's a lot of hard work involved as well, but it certainly looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is hard. It is hard work, but it's always incredibly rewarding. And I think during the course of having the plot and seeing others also on the site doing what they're doing, it reminds me more and more of actually almost how architecture could be or should be. It's this sort of idea of putting a lot of work in early on and then seeing the sort of the fruits of that coming through, quite literally. And there's this sense of that connection to sort of rhythms and seasons and time and materials, which is sort of endlessly fascinating. I just remember there was this one story that my dad likes to tell about when he was working with a Japanese garden designer, and the client asked the garden designer when he was over from Japan, just program wise, when will the garden be complete? And the garden designer said back, oh, about 400 years. So it's that sense to there being a real longevity to this hard work you're putting in now, but actually that many things that you do will be sort of either coming to their fruits that year, that season, or maybe a couple of seasons later, or that tree that you're planting will, people often say is that you're planting a tree to shade your grandchildren, and that's, I think, quite an interesting thing for architects to think about. Is what are we doing now, and how does that then impact on generations to come? So through sort of regenerative materials and the use of that as a sort of stable within sustainability, I feel that there's a sort of connection I have born out of this work on the allotment coming back into architecture now, and this sort of interest in materials and research. And actually as New Works, we're really investigating that now and researching that now, working on projects like the Phoenix project down in Lewes, which is a mass timber, huge site, working with many other architects. I think there's something like 13 or 14 different practices working on that site. And there's a real drive there for to be as sustainable as it can possibly be, but also to use as many regenerative materials as possible. So that's super interesting.
That's so cool. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we could talk about sustainability. That's probably a whole topic for a whole other episode. This episode, though, in particular, we are going to talk about mental health and well-being in architecture, so that we can raise awareness of the issues that people are commonly facing. Also, so that architects and other professionals working in the industry can learn how to safeguard their own mental health, and so that we can try and improve the situation as a whole. Doug, what are your thoughts on the current state of architecture professionals' mental health and well-being in general?
Well, sadly, I sincerely think that we're at a crisis moment in the practice for mental health, or just general health, but especially mental health across the profession. There's an ever-expanding expectation on the individual practitioner to know everything. And it is becoming increasingly complex, especially with the Building Safety Act and other things, which, again, you could talk more, but probably Tom actually is probably a better place to talk about those things, but my business partner. But from my side, from a mental health perspective, I see that alongside things like the cost of living crisis and the working hours practicing architects have to put in as being a huge impact on mental health and physical health to professionals. And I think that it's sad that practices often work well beyond the contracted hours. It's not uncommon, and I'm sure a lot of people listening would recognize this, for practices to have an expectation that people will work beyond contracted hours up to 9, 10, 11 o'clock. When I've worked places like that where we were happy just to get to last orders at the pub, I'm not saying that everyone should go to the pub every day, but it's 11 o'clock. So that's sort of revealing. And then other practices, there's a sort of expectation, if it's not finished by Friday, you'll come in on Saturday, maybe Sunday. And that actually happens very often. We've employed project architects from other practices, large practices, Age of 100 practices, that they regularly worked Saturday and Sunday before they came to work with us when we were TDO. And we never worked weekends at TDO. We never wanted a regularly to work beyond 6 o'clock. We were 9 till 6. And we felt that it was very, very difficult to compete with everyone else who just seemed to be working double the hours that we were on. And then how do you then pay staff if you're trying to achieve the same goals with less time? So I think that is a real pressure on the mental health of within the practice, regardless of where they are, whether you're the youngest and you're expected to do a lot of the production, or you're in the middle and you're expected to manage that and pressure on those to produce, or you're feeling like you're having to report to your bosses that you are achieving targets which are unachievable within the timeframes expected. So that then, I believe, comes down to whether whether the profession is remunerated enough by the wider industry, and a recognition of maybe what architects bring to the wider industry needs to happen.
That's quite a shocking state that you've just described there. It doesn't sound like what anybody entering the industry would have wanted as a career path.
No.
And it sounds like something that people in many other industries just wouldn't put up with that.
And would be astonished to find out, really, because that's not the expectation of someone. If you ask on the street, what does an architect do? I'm sure they think that we wander down the street with a roll of drawings under our arm and, turn up on site and point at a crane, like move that crane, put that panel over that. That's probably what they think we do. They realize that actually it's they're just responding to emails and dealing with crisis after crisis of unknown origin, and trying at the same time to achieve an architecture which we are proud of, that we feel that we can stand up within the profession and that other professionals then won't criticize. So there are pressures from all of them. I think that is what's really impacting and creating this mental health crisis across the age range of professionals, which is incredibly tough to see. But I feel that at this moment in our careers, after having run a practice for 15 years and set up a new practice now, in recognition of that, I feel that it's a moment that we need to start talking about it more.
Absolutely. Well, I think there are certainly more conversations going on about it, and hopefully by highlighting the issues on platforms like this, it's something that we can encourage more people to talk about, and we can try and find some solutions to it. But what do you think the root of it is? Do you think the current education system affects architects' well-being in practice?
Yes, it's a simple answer. I think that education is fundamental. It sort of sets the tone for the whole profession, the culture and the tone. And I've taught, as you mentioned earlier, I taught at Cambridge for a number of years, and that is actually an incredibly well set up course. There, the tutors have a limited amount of influence over their studios or their units. There are lots of other experienced individuals that they can go to talk to, and it's the structure there is actually quite interesting. That, in stark contrast to the Bartlett, where I studied at UCL, where your tutor is like a sort of demigod figure that is all powerful over your entire time, pretty much. And actually, when you arrive on the first day, you arrive as an undergraduate, your first year, you're young, you're ambitious, you're impressionable, you're malleable. They announce to you, all of you as a group, that if you're thinking of joining a club, like rugby club or rowing or, theatre or something, don't do it. You don't have time. You only have time for studio work. If you're thinking of making friends in other departments, don't do it. There's no point. You won't see them. You'll be here. This is actually the words that are coming out of the mouth of the heads of departments. They also announce that not all of you will make it. They announce on that first day that by the end of that first year, 30% will probably drop out. Then by the end of your third year, look around the room, there'll only be 40% of you left. Now, that is setting the tone for a competitive and incredibly sort of powerful moment within these young individuals to look around and go, well, okay, so if I want to make it, if I can't, how can I make this? I have to do everything. You are basically there saying, what are you prepared to give? Are you prepared to give everything to this moment? And that means that's why the students at the Bartlett produce so much work. And you see it at the end of the year show every year, because they don't do anything else. And it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, students sleeping under desks. It's absolutely appalling. And this is all to whose benefit? I mean, you're within the studio unit structures at the Bartlett where you're very much given a style by the studio or the unit tutor to say, right, replicate this. If you want to get a good mark, an acceptable mark, replicate what I do as a professional, whether it's some weird drawing on sticks with sort of floating things like CJ Lim, or it's, something that's a bit more swirly, sort of Neil Spiller-esque. It's, you're asked to replicate. Now, who's the product of those units? I mean, whose benefit is that? It's really, is that, I would ask the question, is it for the tutor and their professional, or their sort of, whether you call it professional, their sort of endeavor, their creative endeavor, or is it for the individual student who was really just there because they wanted to study architecture and maybe build some houses? So I think that there's a fundamental issue there with the way that schools like the Bartlett are set up.
That sounds like a really unhealthy relationship between the student and the tutors. That doesn't sound good at all. I mean, how did that feel at the time? Remember, don't forget to download the Architecture Business Blueprint, the step-by-step formula to freedom for architects, architectural technologists and architectural designers. You can grab the blueprint without any charge at architecturebusinessclub.com/blueprint. And if you're enjoying this episode, then please leave a 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show.
I think when you're in a sort of abusive relationship, we can call it that, well, it is that, you don't really question it because it is all you know. You haven't done it before. So part one, you just turn up. You think you're at a good school and you just try and do your best. And it's only afterwards, and many, many years afterwards. I mean, all of our partners, my husband describes it like when we all get together, that we're sort of like we were in NAM or something. We've all got PTSD from this experience. And it's true. This is years ago. This is 20 years ago. And I'm still feel, when I see someone like CJ Lim now, as I did the other day at the AA, he was guest critic, which I think is an absolute disgrace. He should not have been there. He was there and I got sort of cold, sort of, not cold sweat exactly, but there's the hairs in the back of my neck standing up. And, it's just, I think he had no idea really who I was. And he sort of vaguely recognized me, but it was this sort of odd moment. And I just felt like, why are you here? And I actually mentioned to the head of school at the AA later that day, I said, this is completely unacceptable. He shouldn't be in the building. He shouldn't be near students. And, Ingrid said that, I had no idea that he was coming and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm so sorry. But, Fran Williams from the AJ was there standing next to me and she was like, yeah, it's an absolute shocker. But it's this sort of, there seems to have been a forgetfulness of what happened. There was the whole report on this. This shouldn't go unsaid anymore. So yeah, I think that's bad. But one of the main reasons I think it's bad is that obviously in the moment it's bad, but it's then what it does bleeds into the profession. So as a part one in many of these schools that have sort of similarities to the Bartlett, you go into the profession and you have an expectation that that's just the way you should be treated. So whether or not the practice owners realize this, but that is that they then start behaving like or are treated like the tutor. And so that's why there's this sort of acceptance of mistreatment, I think, of young people in the profession. And that's why they're taking advantage of, because that's what they know. That's what they've been treated like when they were in education. And that's why I think it's incredibly toxic for the profession generally. I also think that whether the people running these practices realize it or not, but actually what they're doing is effectively suppressing fees for the profession, because they're so overly reliant on suppressing on the hours of unpaid work by the young people to support their practices, that they're not charging enough in fees. So when you have either unpaid interns or you have low paid part ones and part twos, some of which is an absolute disgrace. Some of these are on, these people are graduates or twice graduates, and they're on less than a London living wage, and they're expected to work more hours. So therefore, their sort of equivalent pay in other professions is just so distortional. And I think that there's a lot of conversation recently about young doctors and their what they should be paid. And I think that's the sort of conversation that needs to be had in architecture.
I totally agree. I think for the amount of time that's required to learn your craft in architecture and the amount of responsibility there is as designers working in architecture, whether that's as an architect or an architectural technologist or other professionals in the industry, that what we're paid, the fees that people tend to charge just don't reflect that. There's other industries that seem to do far less work at far less risk and get paid far more money for it. And as you say, that these issues that are born out of the education path and the experience that a lot of these younger architects are getting, or the people that are in training, that's carrying through to their willingness to basically just not really be treated very well. That, employers are in a position where, knowingly or not, it's just like, oh, well, they're willing to do this, and that means that I can get more out of them for paying them less money. So it's quite a sad situation that I'm sure we'd all like to see change. I mean, as a profession, more and more is expected of us these days. So how do you think we can avoid overwhelm or worst case burnout?
Well, I think so Tom, my business partner, and I have discussed this a lot in setting up New Works. And we strongly believe that we need to, as a profession, specialize and collaborate. So what we mean by that is to let's concentrate as individuals, as individual architects, on what we're good at and be honest with ourselves about what we're good at, but also what we enjoy. So are we good at the creative front end, which is very sort of client facing, other consultant facing, where we're sort of developing the idea effectively from either an existing built condition that we're sort of adapting, retrofitting, as I'm often involved in, or is it from a sort of more of a blank sort of sheet, if you like, where it's more of a what's the ground condition and work from there, which Tom is often involved in. And that's a really fascinating sort of realm for us. Although we delivered many projects as TDO and enjoyed in part some of those processes, we really came to the realization it wasn't what we were enjoyed the most, and others were better at it. So companies like Veritech, who we collaborate with regularly, they only do that delivery side. They only do stage. Well, they come in at any stage you need them to, alongside you, and always are working at all stages. But they take over that lead design role really within stage 3, through stage 4 and stage 5, and we get to stay on in the project. We always will. We'll always stay all the way through alongside the client. But we have a lesser role. We're really there just for a point of reference, both for the client, but also for the delivery architect. Completely collaborative. They come to us and say, what was the intent here? Well, how should this be? And we then have the tools and we believe we're good at then talking to the client about how and why these things need to happen. Whereas, others are better at that other end, as Veritech are. And I think as a profession, if we're more honest with each other, where we sit within that, I think that we're then capable as people, as just individual humans, to be able to get through the working week in a more measured way. So one of the things that we were just absolutely astonished by Veritech was how calm their office is. They're considering they only do that stage of work. I think there's also a way in which contractors deal with a company like that they just don't behave the same way as they do to a young, design-led, smallish architecture practice. Veritech don't get pushed around. They don't get those incredibly rude phone calls or emails or WhatsApps or whatever it might be at random times of the day, which just completely destroy the working day. They have very strict structures, which are then backed up throughout their organization. And that means that the people that are working within that practice, within those delivery stages, they're protected. Their mental health is protected, and they enjoy it because they are able to develop the detail, to see the realization of these buildings from paper to buildings. And it's they enjoy that, and we enjoy being part of that. But I think there's a realization that what we're actually enjoying more on a day-to-day basis, what we want to be able to do, what we're excited about when we come to work, is that earlier stage. That's our priority.
I love that. I'm a huge fan of collaboration, and what you've described it's something that I've heard a lot of coaches talk about, and some of the online business experts to talk about things like, stay in your zone of genius, or do what you do best and delegate the rest, things like that. And it's like, I think the traditional business model for most practices is very much that we're all service and we have to do everything through all of those work stages, even though we know, actually, if we're really honest, that there's certain work stages that we either really don't look forward to doing, brings us no joy, but we just do it because we think that's what our clients expect of us. We think everyone just wants this all-in-one solution, but having a team working on a project, like that team doesn't all need to be under the same roof. I mean, we're already used to often collaborating with other consultants, whether it's outside of our area of expertise. So say structural engineer would be a good example. Often that's a consultant that's needed on most projects, but actually breaking that down further and saying, well, actually the function of the architect and the lead designer on the project, that can actually be broken down too in the way that you've described, where you say, actually, we really shine in these early work stages. This is what lights us up. This is the reason why we decided to get into architecture. Not because we wanted to be chairing a site meeting with a contractor later or doing a detail. There are other practices, though, that love that. I spent some time working in some small to medium-sized practices earlier in my career, and you get to meet all sorts of different people working in those practices. And there were people there that really shone in particular areas. There's one or two that spring to mind now that when it came to early stage stuff, they were great. There was other guys in the office that stage 4 and 5, they were absolutely amazing. Particularly stage 5, there was some absolute superstars in some of those practices that they were so good at handling all of the site issues and all of that side of it. And how great would it be if you get to go to work every day and you get to do the work that you love to do without having to do so much of the other stuff? That team doesn't all need to be under one roof. You can collaborate with other practitioners and bring in other consultants, and even outsourcing as well is another thing that I think a lot of practices should explore. So there's definitely some mileage in that other practices can take from this. We were talking there about overwhelm, and we've talked about a few ideas there about how people can set their practice up in such a way to try and minimize that and avoid it from happening. But for those people that might be listening that are already feeling overwhelmed or even feeling close to burnout from the work that they're doing, what can we do about it? Do you have any thoughts on that if somebody's listening and they're already feeling really overwhelmed with the work that they're doing? You can hear the rest of my conversation with Doug in the next episode. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Architecture Business Club. If you liked this episode, think other people might enjoy it, or just want to show your support for the show, then please leave a glowing 5-star review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. It would mean so much to me and makes it easier for new listeners to discover the show. And if you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another episode. If you want to connect with me, you can do that on most social media platforms. Just search for @Mr. John Clayton. The best place to connect with me online, though, is on LinkedIn. You can find a link to my profile in the show notes. Remember, running your architecture business doesn't have to be hard, and you don't need to do it alone. This is Architecture Business Club.